Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, a sleepy summary of the objects that connect us. Get comfortable. Tonight's story is a walk through a brief history of information networks, from the Stone Age to AI, and we're going to trace that history through the physical objects that carried information from one mind to another across thousands of years. Clay, reed, skin, paper, metal type, electricity, silicon. Because Harari's whole point, gently held, is that information was never really about representing truth. It was about connection, about binding scattered, separate human minds into a single working network. And if that's true, then the physical shape of the object carrying the information matters enormously, because the shape of the object decides how far a piece of information can travel, how many people can touch it, how long it can last, and how easily it can be checked, copied, or corrected. So tonight, let's walk slowly through each of those objects, one at a time, and feel how each new shape changed what kind of human network was possible. We begin, as always, before any of these objects existed at all, in the deep hush of prehistory, when the only medium for carrying information was the fragile, flickering human voice, and the only storage device was human memory itself. A story told around a fire could travel only as far as a voice could carry, and only as long as someone remembered to retell it. This was an intimate network, warm and immediate, but a laky one. Every retelling reshaped the story a little, the way a whispered rumor changes as it moves down a line of listeners. For the vast majority of human existence, this was the only kind of network we had, and it capped the size of any group that could stay coordinated at somewhere around the number of people whose faces and voices you could actually remember. Then, in ancient Mesopotamia, in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, something new appeared: clay. Ordinary, damp river clay, pressed flat into small tablets that could sit in the palm of a hand. Someone took a cut reed, sharpened it into a wedge shape, and began pressing marks into the wet clay's surface, not drawing with ink, but physically impressing shapes into the material itself, leaving a groove that would harden and last. This is cuneiform, one of the very first writing systems in human history, and Harari wants us to notice something important about it before we even get to what it recorded. It was chosen because it was cheap, abundant, and durable. Clay was everywhere along the riverbanks. It cost nothing to acquire, and once it dried in the sun or was baked in a kiln, it became remarkably tough. Clay tablets from 4,000 and 5,000 years ago have survived to this day, buried in the rubble of collapsed cities, more durable in many ways than the paper we use now. This durability is the whole point. For the first time, a piece of information could physically outlive the moment it was created, outlive the person who created it, and be picked up by a stranger months or years later, and still say the same thing it said the day it was pressed into the clay. That is an entirely new kind of connection, a connection across time, not just across a room. And what did these very first durable, time-traveling messages actually say? Not poetry, not prayers, not history. Mostly they were lists. So-and-so delivered this many sacks of barley. This household owes this many silver shekels in tax. This many sheep belong to the temple. Harari lingers on this almost mundane origin on purpose, because it tells us something true about what writing was actually for at first. It was a bureaucratic technology, invented to let a temple or a palace keep track of a kingdom that had grown too large and too complicated for any single human memory to hold. The wedge-shaped marks started out as simple pictures, a little drawing of a cow's head to mean cow, a sheaf shape to mean grain, but pictures like that are slow to draw and can only represent things you can literally picture. Over centuries, the scribes of Mesopotamia gradually pushed the system to become more abstract, so that the wedge mark stopped standing directly for objects and started standing for sounds, for syllables, for the building blocks of spoken language itself. This shift from pictures of things to symbols for sounds mattered enormously for connection, because a system built on sound could, in principle, write down anything that could be spoken, not just the narrow list of objects that happen to have obvious pictures. It made the network of things that could be recorded almost limitless, but cuneiform stayed complicated. Hundreds of different wedge combinations to memorize, requiring years of dedicated training. This meant that even though clay tablets could now, in theory, carry almost any information across almost any distance of time, only a small, specially trained class of scribes could actually read or write them. The network cuneiform built was wide across time, but narrow across people. A long, thin thread connecting distant generations of the literate few. Around the same broad era, along the Nile, the Egyptians were pressing marks into a different material entirely, papyrus, made from the pith of a tall reed plant that grew thickly along the riverbanks. Egyptian scribes would slice the reed stalk into thin strips, lay them in a crosswise grid, press and pound them together under weight, and let the plant's own natural sap glue the strips into a single continuous sheet as it dried. The result was something clay could never be: light. A stack of papyrus sheets could be carried under one arm, rolled into a scroll, tucked into a bag, and taken on a boat, on foot, across a desert. Where a clay tablet was a monument, heavy and stationary, papyrus was a traveler. And this changed the shape of the network again. Now information didn't just persist across time sitting in one archive room. It could actually move geographically, following trade routes, following armies, following pilgrims and merchants and diplomats, connecting distant cities to each other in something closer to real time. But papyrus paid a price for its lightness. It was fragile. It could tear, crumble, rot in damp conditions, and be devoured by insects. Almost none of it survives today, except in the exceptionally dry conditions of the Egyptian desert. So here is an early, gentle lesson Harari wants us to absorb, half asleep, as this story continues. Every physical medium for carrying information makes a trade-off. Clay was heavy but nearly eternal. Papyrus was light and mobile but fragile and short-lived. There is no perfect object, only different shapes of compromise between how far information can travel, how long it can last, and how easily ordinary people can actually use it. The next great leap in this parade of physical objects happened not with a new material, but with a radically simplified way of marking that material: the alphabet. Somewhere along the eastern Mediterranean coast, among Semitic-speaking traders and craftsmen, the people who would become known as the Phoenicians, a wildly different idea took hold. Instead of hundreds of complicated symbols standing for whole syllables or ideas, as in cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphics, why not use a small handful of simple symbols, each one standing for a single basic consonant sound? Just a couple dozen marks, combined and recombined, could represent essentially any word in the spoken language. This was a staggering simplification, and Harari treats it as one of the great connection-multiplying inventions in this whole long history, because what cuneiform's scribal complexity had kept locked away from ordinary people, the alphabet suddenly threw open. A merchant's child or an apprentice craftsman could learn 22 letters in a matter of weeks, not the years of specialized training cuneiform or hieroglyphics demanded. And because the Phoenicians were, above all, seafaring traders, sailing their ships from port to port around the Mediterranean, they carried this compact, learnable alphabet with them everywhere they went, the way a useful tool spreads naturally along a trade network. The Greeks encountered it and adapted it, adding symbols for vowel sounds that Phoenicians' consonant-only system had left for the reader to guess, producing something close to what we would now call a true alphabet, capable of representing spoken language with real precision. From the Greeks, it passed to the Etruscans and then the Romans, whose letters, more or less unchanged in their basic shapes, are the very letters spelling out these words right now. Harari wants us to feel, in this drowsy retelling, just how much wider a network the alphabet allowed than anything before it. Not just a network across time like clay, and not just a network across distance like papyrus, but for the first time, a network across social class. A technology simple enough that literacy could begin, slowly, unevenly, but genuinely, to spread beyond a narrow scribal elite. Now once papyrus sheets were being made, and later once animal skins were being prepared as a writing surface too, a natural question arose. How do you organize a very long text, one too long to fit on a single sheet? The answer, for a very long stretch of the ancient world, was the scroll. Sheets of papyrus were glued edge to edge into one long continuous strip, sometimes many meters long, and then rolled around a wooden rod at each end. To read a scroll, you unrolled it from one hand while rolling it back up with the other, moving steadily through the text from beginning to end, the way you might slowly unwind a long ribbon. This format worked wonderfully for reading a text straight through, the way you'd read a poem or a story, start to finish, in order. But Harari points out, gently, how poorly the scroll served a very different, very important kind of reading, the kind where you need to jump back and forth, to check one passage against another, to find a specific line quickly without reading everything that came before it. Imagine trying to look up a single reference in the middle of a scroll 10 meters long. You would have to physically unroll and re-roll enormous lengths of fragile material just to locate one sentence. This made scrolls wonderful vessels for stories and rituals, recited or read start to finish, but clumsy tools for exactly the kind of cross-referencing, argument, and comparison that would later become so important to law, scholarship, and scripture. And here Harari layers in another crucial piece of the puzzle. Because papyrus and later the animal skin writing material called parchment were expensive and laborious to produce, and because every single scroll had to be copied out entirely by hand, letter by letter, by a trained scribe, the great libraries of the ancient world, the most famous being the legendary library at Alexandria in Egypt, functioned as central hubs in a network of hand-copied scrolls, spreading knowledge only as fast as scribes could physically copy it, and travelers could physically carry it. This copying process, Harari reminds us, was itself a kind of slow-motion echo of the old oral networks problem. Every time a human scribe copied a scroll by hand, there was a chance of a small error creeping in, a misread word, a skipped line, a spelling slip, and those small errors could then be copied again into the next generation of copies, sometimes compounding over centuries into meaningfully different versions of what was supposed to be the exact same text. Keeping a scroll's content stable and accurate across time and distance required an entire secondary network of careful scribes, editors, and librarians dedicated to comparing copies against each other and correcting drift. An early, physical, exhausting version of the very self-correction problem that runs through this whole book. Eventually, as parchment made from carefully scraped and stretched animal skin, usually calf, sheep, or goat, became more widely available, especially in regions where papyrus reeds didn't grow, a new physical format for organizing text began to emerge, and Harari treats its arrival as genuinely revolutionary: the codex. Instead of one long continuous roll, imagine cutting sheets into rectangles, stacking them, and binding them together along one edge, so that the text could be written on both sides of every page, and a reader could open the stack anywhere, flip forward or backward, and land instantly on any point in the text without unrolling anything at all. This is, of course, simply the bound book, the shape so familiar to us now that it barely feels like a technology at all. But Harari asks us to imagine how radical it must have felt the first time someone held one. Suddenly random access was possible. You could flip straight to a specific passage, rather than patiently unrolling toward it. Suddenly both sides of the writing material could be used, roughly doubling how much text a given amount of parchment or papyrus could hold. Suddenly a book could have something a scroll never really could: a table of contents, an index, page numbers, cross-references, footnotes, marginal notes scribbled by a reader beside a passage that puzzled or excited them. This is why Harari draws a direct line from the physical shape of the codex to the rise of exactly the kind of scholarly, legal, and religious argument and commentary culture he described earlier in this story: rabbis debating passages of the Talmud, church councils debating scripture, lawyers citing precedent. None of that intensive cross-referencing work is impossible with scrolls, but it becomes vastly easier, faster, and more natural once a text lives inside a codex you can flip through. Early Christian communities were among the most enthusiastic early adopters of the codex format for exactly this reason, favoring it over the scroll, even while much of the wider Roman world still preferred scrolls for literature. And some historians think this practical advantage in cross-referencing and portability may have quietly helped the new codex-carried religion spread and organize itself more effectively than it otherwise might have. For many centuries after this, across the medieval world in Europe, in the Islamic caliphates, and elsewhere, books were still produced entirely by hand, and Harari lingers on what this meant for the shape of the network they built. In European monasteries, monks sat for hours in rooms called scriptoriums, copying manuscripts letter by careful letter, sometimes illuminating the pages with intricate painted decoration, a process that could take a single scribe the better part of a year to produce just one complete book. This made books extraordinarily precious, expensive objects, often chained to lecterns in monastery libraries to prevent theft, accessible mainly to clergy, nobility, and a small circle of scholars. The network that books built during these centuries was, in Harari's framework, a narrow one deep, in the sense that a well-tended manuscript tradition could preserve a text with real care and accuracy across generations of careful copying. But narrow, in the sense that very few people could ever actually touch, read, or challenge what those books said. This is part of why, in Harari's telling, so many medieval information networks tilted so heavily toward order over truth, toward obedience over open correction. When only a tiny fraction of the population could read at all, and an even tinier fraction had access to books, whatever sat inside those rare, expensive, laboriously hand-copied pages could exert enormous unquestioned authority, simply because there was no realistic way for outsiders to check it, compare it, or push back against it. Two more physical developments, arriving from the East, quietly set the stage for the next great transformation Harari describes. The first was paper itself, invented centuries earlier in Han Dynasty China, made by pulping plant fibers, mulberry bark, old rags, and hemp, then straining the resulting slurry through a fine mesh screen and letting it dry into thin, flat sheets. Paper was cheaper to produce in bulk than either papyrus, which needed a specific reed that only grew in certain river environments, or parchment, which required an entire animal skin per sheet. Knowledge of papermaking slowly traveled west along trade routes, passing through Central Asia and the Islamic world, where paper mills flourished for centuries before the technology finally reached medieval Europe, arriving there gradually through Muslim Spain and Sicily and northern Italy over the 12th and 13th centuries. This cheaper, more abundant writing material quietly lowered the cost of producing a book, setting the stage for what was coming. Because what was coming, of course, was the printing press, and Harari treats its arrival in the workshop of a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg in the middle of the 15th century as one of the single most consequential moments in this entire long history of physical information objects. Gutenberg's real breakthrough wasn't printing itself, woodblock printing, where an entire page was carved in relief on a single block of wood and stamped onto paper again and again, had existed for centuries already, especially in East Asia. Gutenberg's breakthrough was movable metal types. Individual letters, each cast separately in a metal alloy designed to melt at a manageable temperature and hold a crisp, durable shape, small enough to be picked up, arranged into words and lines by hand, locked into a frame, inked, and pressed onto paper using a mechanism adapted from the humble household wine press or olive press, whose screw-driven downward force turned out to be exactly the steady. Even pressure needed to transfer ink from raised metal letters onto a sheet of paper without smudging. And crucially, once a page of type was set and printed, those same individual metal letters could be pulled apart, redistributed back into their trays, and rearranged into an entirely new page of text, over and over again, essentially forever. This is what movable type actually gave the world. For the first time in history, a piece of information could be reproduced not through the slow, error-prone human hand of a scribe, but through an unthinking mechanical process that produced hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of genuinely identical copies of the exact same words, at a speed no scriptorium full of monks could ever hope to match. Harari wants us to sit with how strange and double-edged this mechanical fixity actually was for the shape of the human information network. On one hand, printing solved the ancient scribal drift problem almost overnight. Because every copy came from the same locked frame of type, the small copying errors that had crept into handwritten manuscripts for thousands of years suddenly became far less common within a single print run, and a scholar in one city could trust, with far more confidence than ever before, that the printed book in their hands said exactly the same thing as the printed book in a colleague's hands 300 miles away. This new reliability of the copied text is part of what made possible the great cross-checking, citation-heavy work of the later scientific revolution. Researchers building on each other's findings with real confidence that they were reading the same data, the same tables, the same careful descriptions. On the other hand, that very same mechanical fixity meant that whatever got set into type, true or false, wise or cruel, could now be reproduced identically and distributed astonishingly widely, astonishingly fast, without any human scribe along the way pausing to reconsider, correct, or soften what was being copied. Harari returns, in this retelling, to his favorite unsettling example from this era: witch-hunting manuals, instructing readers in gruesome detail on how to identify, interrogate, and execute supposed witches, went through printing after printing, edition after edition, across many decades, precisely because the press did not care whether what it multiplied was wisdom or cruelty. It simply multiplied whatever was locked into its metal frame, at a scale and speed the handwritten world had never experienced. And the printing press changed something else about the shape of the network too, language itself. In the age of hand-copied manuscripts, scholarly and religious texts across Europe had mostly been written and copied in Latin, the shared learned language of a small literate elite spread across many different countries. But printing needed to sell books to make its enormous start-up costs worthwhile, and vastly more ordinary people could read their own local spoken language than could read Latin. So printers increasingly began producing books in French, in German, in English, in Italian, in the actual living languages people spoke at home. And Harari points to the German reformer Martin Luther's use of the printing press as a particularly vivid example. Luther's arguments against the Catholic Church, printed cheaply and quickly in German rather than Latin, spread across the German-speaking lands with a speed that stunned religious and political authorities, used to the much slower pace of hand-copied Latin manuscripts, helping fracture the unified religious network of medieval Christian Europe within just a few short years. Here again, Harari wants us to notice print wasn't choosing sides between truth and falsehood, between unity and conflict. It was simply making whatever content it carried travel further and faster than any physical object carrying information ever had before, for good and for ill, all at once. From the individual bound book, printing soon gave rise to something newer still. The periodical, the newspaper, the pamphlet, texts designed not to be read once and shelved, but produced regularly, dated, distributed on a predictable schedule, meant to be read, discussed, and then replaced by next week's or next day's edition. This regular, repeating rhythm of printed news created something like a shared, ongoing present-tense conversation among strangers scattered across a city or a country, a rolling public network of information that hadn't quite existed in the same way when knowledge lived mainly in static, slowly copied books and scrolls. Coffee houses across 17th and 18th century European cities became gathering points where these fresh printed sheets were read aloud, argued over, and passed from hand to hand, forming the physical, face-to-face social network wrapped around this newer paper network. From here, Harari's story begins to move faster, the way objects tend to arrive more quickly the closer we get to our own time. But he wants us to notice that each new physical medium keeps repeating the same basic pattern, a change in material or mechanism that changes how far, how fast, and to how many people information can travel. The telegraph, in the middle of the 19th century, was the first medium to fully separate the movement of information from the movement of any physical object at all. Instead of a letter or a newspaper being carried by horse, ship, or train, an electrical pulse could now travel down a copper wire at nearly the speed of light itself, eventually strung beneath entire oceans, so that a message could cross a continent or an ocean in minutes rather than weeks. The telephone let that same electrical connection carry the sound of an actual human voice, live in real time, across enormous distances. Radio and then television carried that live voice and image not down a single wire to one recipient, but broadcast outward invisibly through the air itself, to any receiver within range, allowing one single source to speak instantly to millions of listeners or viewers at once, an astonishing new one-to-many shape for the information network to take. And then, in the latter half of the 20th century, arrived the object Harari treats as perhaps the strangest physical carrier of information yet. The computer, storing not physical marks on physical material at all, but tiny electrical and magnetic states, arranged into the endless combinations of ones and zeros we call bits, capable of representing text, sound, and image, all in the exact same underlying format, endlessly and perfectly copyable at essentially zero cost, transmittable in fractions of a second across networks of cables and satellites spanning the entire globe. Where a hand-copied medieval manuscript might take a scribe the better part of a year to reproduce once, and a printing press might produce a few thousand identical copies over a print run of days or weeks, a digital file can be copied without any loss of fidelity whatsoever, an effectively unlimited number of times, instantly, and sent to the other side of the planet in the time it takes to blink. The Internet then wove these countless individual digital documents together with hyperlinks, turning the old librarian's dream of a cross-referenced universal library into something Harari describes as almost literalized, a web, in the truest sense, connecting nearly every stored piece of human information to nearly every other, at least in principle, at the click of a finger. Social media platforms then layered algorithms on top of this already staggering network. Systems designed not simply to store or transmit information, but to actively decide, moment by moment, which pieces of information each individual person would actually see, based on predictions about what would hold that person's attention longest. And it's here, at the very edge of this long chain of physical carriers, clay, papyrus, parchment, paper, metal type, electrical pulse, magnetic bit, that Harari identifies something genuinely new, something none of the previous objects in this long story ever quite managed to do. A clay tablet could not decide what to write on itself. A printing press could not decide what to set into type. A telegraph wire could not decide what message to send down itself. Every one of these earlier objects, however transformative, remained fundamentally passive, waiting for a human hand and a human mind to create the content that would then be stored, copied, or transmitted. Artificial intelligence, Harari argues, breaks this pattern for the first time in this entire long chain of technologies. It can generate genuinely new content on its own, form what look like judgments, and adjust its own future behavior based on what it has processed, without a human mind directly authoring each new piece of information that emerges from it. Every earlier leap in this story changed how fast, how far, and to how many people information could travel once a human had created it. This latest leap changes something different and more unsettling. Who or what gets to create the information traveling through the network in the first place? This is why Harari closes his long historical procession of physical objects with such real unease about artificial intelligence specifically, rather than simply filing it away as one more entry on this same list of clay, scrolls, books, and wires. Every previous medium, however wildly it accelerated or amplified human error, cruelty, or brilliance, ultimately still required a human being somewhere in the chain to decide what the words would say. AI, for the first time in this long parade of information-carrying objects, does not need that human hand at every step, and that missing hand, Harari warns softly but seriously, is exactly why the oldest lesson of this whole history, that a network's health depends not on how much information it moves, but on whether it can catch and correct its own mistakes, matters more now than at any point since the very first wedge-shaped mark was pressed into a piece of wet Mesopotamian clay. Before we let that table finally go quiet, it's worth pausing over a few more objects lingering in the shadows at its edges, because they round out this physical story in ways worth carrying gently into sleep. Alongside cuneiform and the alphabet, another entirely different approach to marking meaning developed far to the east, in ancient China, where scribes pressed and later brushed symbols that stood not primarily for sounds, the way the Phoenician alphabet did, but far more directly for whole words and ideas. A vast, ever-growing set of characters, each one a small picture-turned symbol representing a concept. This logographic approach demanded a genuinely enormous amount of memorization, thousands of distinct characters for full literacy, a real barrier to entry that echoed the narrow scribal networks of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. But Harari notes an interesting compensating advantage this different physical approach carried with it. Because Chinese characters were tied more to meaning than to the sound of any one spoken dialect, the same written character could be read and understood by people who spoke wildly different, mutually unintelligible spoken dialects across a vast and geographically diverse empire, giving China's writing system an unusual power to hold a huge and linguistically varied population together inside a single connected reading network, even where the spoken word alone would have divided them. It's a lovely, quiet illustration of Harari's larger point. There was never one single correct shape for a writing system to take. Different physical and symbolic choices brought different kinds of connection at different costs, suited to different landscapes of people, geography, and power. Back in the world of ink and page, it's worth lingering a little longer, too, on exactly how much sheer human labor a single medieval manuscript actually demanded, because the scale of that effort is part of what explains why books stayed so rare and so precious for so long. Producing a single sheet of parchment already required an entire animal skin, soaking it in a lime solution to loosen the hair, scraping it clean on both sides with a curved blade, stretching it taut on a wooden frame to dry flat, then rubbing it smooth with pumice until it could hold ink evenly. A single substantial book might require the skins of dozens of animals, an entire flock's worth of parchment just to bind one Bible or one legal codex. Then came the actual writing, a scribe working in a scriptorium, often in a cold, dimly lit room by candlelight or through a small window, dipping a hand-cut quill pen into ink made from ingredients like oak galls and iron salts, copying letter by letter, line by line, for hours at a stretch, day after day, sometimes for the better part of a year for a single lengthy work. Illuminated manuscripts added another whole layer of labor on top of this. Gold leaf hammered impossibly thin and carefully applied, pigments ground by hand from minerals and plants, elaborate decorative borders and miniature paintings worked into the margins by specialist artists, sometimes different from the scribe who had copied the text itself. Every one of these steps, Harari wants us to feel, was a bottleneck limiting how wide the network built around any single text could possibly grow, no matter how important or beloved that text was. A truly popular sacred or legal text might exist in only a few dozen or a few hundred copies scattered across an entire continent, each one a treasured, guarded, expensive object, each one requiring careful, deliberate effort to compare against the others, whenever scholars worried that copying errors might have crept in over the generations. This is also why, when paper finally began arriving in Europe from the Islamic world in meaningful quantities, and later when Gutenberg's movable type met that cheaper, more abundant paper supply, the resulting explosion in how many books could exist felt less like a gradual improvement and more like an entirely new order of magnitude. Historians have estimated that in the 50 years or so after Gutenberg's press began operating, more books were produced in Europe than had been produced by all the continent's scribes in the many centuries before it combined. Harari treats this specific, almost unbelievable acceleration as the clearest possible illustration of his whole argument about physical media and network size. The underlying human hunger for stories, laws, scripture, and news hadn't suddenly changed in the 15th century, but the physical bottleneck standing between that hunger and its satisfaction had, almost overnight, been blown wide open, and the network of who could access written information, and how quickly a single idea could reach thousands of readers, reshaped itself with startling speed as a direct result. It's worth noting, too, drowsily, that this pattern of physical bottlenecks easing and then suddenly reshaping a network didn't stop with Gutenberg. It simply kept repeating, each time at a faster tempo than the last. Where it took roughly 50 years for print to outproduce centuries of hand copying, it took only a few decades for radio to reach tens of millions of households after starting from almost nothing, and only a handful of years for the internet and then smartphones to place a device capable of instantly reaching billions of other devices into most human pockets on the planet. Each new object in this long procession has needed less time than the one before it to reshape the network around itself. And Harari asks us to sit with that quietly accelerating rhythm as we think about what an object as capable and as fast as artificial intelligence might do next, given how little time history suggests it may need. And so, as this quieter, slower version of the story comes to rest, picture the whole procession laid out gently before you, like objects on a long table in a dimly lit museum you're wandering through half asleep. A small sun-baked tablet with wedge marks pressed into its surface, a curling roll of golden papyrus, a heavy sheet of stretched calfskin parchment, a bound and illuminated medieval manuscript chained to a lectern, a crisp sheet fresh off Gutenberg's press with the ink barely dry, a folded newspaper still smelling faintly of the printing house, a coil of undersea telegraph cable, a glowing screen, and finally, at the very end of the table, something with no fixed physical shape at all. A pattern of numbers shifting inside a machine, generating new sentences no human hand quite wrote. Each object on that table changed how far a piece of information could travel, how long it could last, and how many hands could touch it, and each one, in its own quiet way, reshaped the size and the shape of the human network built around it. The story those objects tell, taken all together, slowly, gently, from the first pressed clay tablet to the last flickering digital pattern, is simply this: the tools for connecting human minds have never stopped changing, and they never really finish changing either. There is always a next object, a next material, a next shape for the network to take. Tonight, though the table is quiet, the objects are still, and there is nothing left to do but rest, and let tomorrow's page, whatever material it turns out to be written on, wait patiently until you wake, sleep well, and in the end, this sleepy summary, with its relaxing tone and warm glow, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to honor and point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care, and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose, and every story they told, and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too.